The mammoth stands at the ridge, 11 feet of muscle and fur against the winter sky, 12,000 pounds of power, tusks that could gore a hunter with a single sweep, speed that could run down any human foolish enough to approach alone, natural armor in hide thick as a finger, defensive instincts honed across millions of years of evolution. Every physical advantage belongs to the giant. And yet the humans watching from concealment will hunt this animal successfully. Not through strength they don't possess, not through speed they cannot match, not through weapons nature gave them, for they have none, but through something else entirely. This was the reality facing your ancestors throughout the Ice Age. Not occasional lucky encounters with wounded prey, but systematic, repeatable hunting of animals 10 to 20 times human weight. Mammoths weighing 12,000 pounds, woolly rhinoceros at 6,000 pounds, giant ground sloths reaching 8,000 pounds. The largest, most dangerous animals walking frozen landscapes. Creatures that should have been untouchable by beings as weak and slow and small as humans. How did they do it? How did humans weighing 150 pounds develop the capability to regularly kill animals weighing 12,000 pounds? What combination of intelligence, cooperation, technology, and strategy allowed our ancestors to overcome impossible physical disadvantages and become successful hunters of Ice Age giants? Tonight's story answers that question, not through dramatic battles or heroic conquests, but through the patient, systematic strategies that made megafauna hunting viable. We'll watch hunters track herds for days, gathering intelligence about vulnerable individuals. We'll observe the behavioral knowledge accumulated across generations about how mammoths move and react and defend themselves. We'll see coordination develop where 25 individuals function as unified hunting machine. We'll discover how spear thrower technology extended range from 50 feet to 200 feet, fundamentally changing tactical possibilities. We'll understand terrain exploitation where bogs and slopes became weapons that negated size advantages. We'll learn seasonal timing strategies targeting periods when animals weakened from winter or migration. We'll follow target selection that identified which specific mammoths were huntable and which should be avoided. We'll examine anatomical knowledge directing strikes to regions where stone points could reach vital organs. We'll explore fire use for tactical positioning and herd manipulation. We'll appreciate patience measured in days of preparation for 45 minutes of engagement. We'll witness processing systems that transformed 8,000 pounds of mammoth into 3 months of food. We'll see knowledge transmission teaching next generations across years of training. We'll recognize how intelligence overcame size through planning, cooperation, technology, and accumulated wisdom. This isn't a story about bravery or violence, it's about intelligence, cognitive capability to observe patterns and predict behavior, social cooperation requiring specialized roles and precise coordination, technological innovation, extending human capability through tools, strategic thinking, exploiting terrain and timing and vulnerability, cultural learning, allowing each generation to build upon ancestors' knowledge, the remarkable human capacity to solve problems systematically, to plan across days, to work as coordinated groups, to use accumulated knowledge and designed tools to overcome physical limitations that should have made megafauna hunting impossible. If you drift off before the story ends, that's perfect. These words are here to carry you gently toward rest. If you find comfort here, consider subscribing so there's always another story waiting. And if you'd like to support this work, there's a link below. For now, though, just settle in. Get comfortable. Let the modern world fade. We're going back to frozen landscapes where the largest land animals that ever walked faced hunters who by every physical measure should have been no threat at all. And we're discovering together how humans developed systematic hunting strategies combining tracking, intelligence, and behavioral knowledge, and group coordination, and distance weapons, and terrain exploitation, and seasonal timing, and selective targeting, and anatomical precision, and cultural transmission, demonstrating that intelligence and cooperation can overcome impossible odds, that planning and patience outmatch raw power, that humans became apex predators not through physical dominance, but through cognitive and social capabilities that allowed small, weak, slow beings to hunt successfully the mightiest giants of the Ice Age, one carefully planned hunt at a time, until mammoths and humans understood each other as predator and prey, despite the absurd mismatch in size and strength. Snow stretches across the landscape, unmarked except where wind shapes shallow patterns into its surface, and against this whiteness dark forms move slowly, their breath rising in visible clouds that hang briefly before cold air absorbs them back into stillness. A woolly mammoth stands perhaps 200 paces away, its massive frame rising 11 feet from ground to the peak of its humped shoulder. That measurement representing the distance from packed snow to the highest point of its back covered first in hide, reaching nearly 1 inch thick and then layered over with dense fur hanging in long dark strands that extend downward 2 feet or more, each hair coarse and strong, creating insulation that allows the animal to survive temperatures dropping to 30 degrees below zero or colder during the deepest months of winter, when wind tears across open ground without mercy. The creature measures 15 feet in length from the flexible trunk that constantly moves and tests air for scents to the short tail at its hindquarters, and the total weight of this single animal reaches somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 pounds, depending on season and condition, with autumn bringing peak mass when summer feeding has layered fat beneath hide and muscle, while late winter sees weight dropping as months of scarce food and constant cold deplete those carefully built reserves that mean the difference between surviving until spring or weakening until predators or illness finish what starvation began. Curved tusks extend from the skull, each one reaching 8 to 10 feet in length, ivory yellowed by time and use. These massive tools employed both for clearing snow to reach buried vegetation during winter months when grasses lie hidden beneath frozen layers, and as formidable weapons capable of goring any predator or threat that approaches without proper caution, the points sharp enough to pierce hide and the weight behind them sufficient to break bones or crush a body with a single strike delivered in defense or rage. The mammoth possesses surprising speed despite bulk that seems to promise only slow, ponderous movement, capable of charging at speeds approaching 20 miles per hour when threatened or provoked, covering ground faster than any human can sprint even for short distances. Those massive legs driving forward with force that shakes earth and sends snow flying as hooves the size of large bowls strike surface with each stride. The animal's small eyes, nearly hidden in fur and wrinkled skin, can spot movement at considerable distances, while its hearing detects sounds across the frozen landscape, and the sensitive trunk reads changes in air that speak of approaching storms, nearby water sources, the presence of other mammoths in the area, or the scent of potential threats, including the particular smell of humans that experience has taught these giants to recognize and avoid when possible, because despite their size and power, mammoths understand that human groups represent danger in ways that individual wolves or lions do not. Now consider the humans who observe this mammoth from their careful distance, remaining still so their forms blend with rocks and snow-covered brush, each individual hunter weighing perhaps 130 to 170 pounds. Their bodies lean from constant movement and periods when food runs scarce. With the entire hunting party, numbering perhaps 20 to 30 individuals, representing a collective weight of somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 pounds, depending on the exact number of hunters and their individual sizes. This means the total mass of the entire human group amounts to less than half the weight of the single mammoth they observe, creating a size disparity that appears to make hunting such an animal not merely difficult but impossible. A confrontation between unequal forces where physical strength resides entirely with the massive prey animal, while humans possess no natural weapons like fangs or claws capable of harming such bulk, no hide thick enough to withstand a strike from those tusks, no speed sufficient to escape a charge once it begins, no strength that could wrestle or overpower an animal 10 times heavier than any single hunter, and 6 times heavier than the entire group combined. Yet hunting parties do bring down mammoths, and not rarely, not through desperate lucky strikes, but through systematic efforts that succeed often enough to make mammoth hunting a reliable, if challenging, source of food that can sustain a group for weeks or months when successful, providing not only thousands of pounds of meat, but also hides large enough to cover shelters, bones strong enough to form structural frameworks, fat that burns for warmth and cooks food, ivory that becomes tools, and sinew that binds materials together into new forms. The question rises naturally from this profound imbalance of size and strength. How do humans weighing 150 pounds successfully hunt animals weighing 12,000 pounds, creatures equipped with natural weapons that can kill with single strikes, possessing speed that allows escape or devastating charges, living within herds that offer mutual protection and defensive formations, demonstrating intelligence that recognizes threats and responds to danger with coordinated group defense? The answer does not lie in superior strength, which humans utterly and completely lack, nor in natural weapons like claws or fangs that could harm such massive animals, nor in reckless bravery or heroic charges into danger that would result only in human death and mammoth escape, but rather in something entirely different, something that transforms apparent impossibility into achievable reality through patient application of specifically human capabilities. The hunters watching this mammoth have not arrived at this position by chance or sudden decision made in the moment, but rather through days of careful tracking and observation that began when scouts first located this particular herd moving across the landscape 3 days earlier, noting its composition and movement patterns, identifying which individuals showed signs that might indicate vulnerability to hunting pressure. They have followed from safe distances, watching how the group moves, where it feeds, which water sources it visits, how defensive formations shift when the herd senses potential threats, and most importantly, which individuals might be separated from the protective structure that female mammoths maintain around young and vulnerable members. The single mammoth now under observation has drifted slightly away from the main herd, not dramatically separated, but positioned at the edge where the protective circle of massive bodies does not fully encompass it. And the hunters have noted that this animal favors its left front leg slightly when walking, a subtle indication that might mean old injury or developing weakness, that makes this particular mammoth a more viable target than the healthy bulls at the center of the herd, whose perfect condition and aggressive defensive behavior make them nearly impossible to hunt without unacceptable risk to human life. What happens next will not involve heroic charges or individual combat between human and mammoth, no single hunter stepping forward to face the giant in some test of courage or skill, but rather the coordinated execution of a plan that has been developing over days of observation and hours of quiet discussion among experienced hunters who have participated in mammoth hunts before and understand exactly what strategies succeed and which lead to failure or death. Intelligence will overcome impossible physical disadvantage not through magic or luck, but through systematic application of accumulated knowledge transmitted across generations, precise coordination requiring every member of the hunting party to perform specific roles at exact moments, technological innovation in weapon design that extends human capability beyond natural limits, strategic use of landscape features that favor lighter, more agile humans while limiting the mobility advantages that size normally provides to mammoths. And above all, patience measured not in moments, but in days. The willingness to invest enormous time and effort into preparation and positioning before any hunting attempt occurs, accepting that even with perfect preparation, most attempts end in strategic retreat when conditions prove unfavorable or the animal behaves in ways that increase danger beyond acceptable limits. The tracking begins not with following the mammoth currently under observation, but with locating the herd days earlier when scouts ranging ahead of the main group spot distant shapes moving across snow-covered ground, dark forms visible against white landscape even at distances exceeding a mile, when air is clear and cold reduces the shimmer that makes distant objects uncertain in warmer weather. These scouts approach carefully, using terrain features like low ridges and scattered brush to keep their forms below the horizon line where mammoth eyes might detect movement, drawing close enough to confirm that, yes, these are mammoths, not the bison or horses that also roam these areas, and then beginning the patient work of observation that transforms distant shapes into detailed knowledge about specific individuals within the herd structure that mammoth groups maintain with remarkable consistency. The scouts count perhaps 15 to 20 animals in this particular herd, mostly females and juveniles moving together with several young bulls at the edges and one massive bull maintaining position slightly separate from the main group, his size and solitary positioning marking him as fully adult and potentially aggressive if approached, exactly the sort of individual that experienced hunters know to avoid because large bulls represent maximum danger with no compensating advantage since their wariness and power make successful hunting attempts rare enough that groups learn to focus elsewhere. The scouts watch movement patterns, noting which direction the herd travels, how quickly they move, whether they're feeding as they go or traveling with purpose toward some destination known to them through experience or instinct. And after several hours of observation from various positions, they return to the main hunting camp to report what they've found, describing the herd's size and composition in detail that allows the group to decide whether pursuing this particular herd makes sense or whether continuing the search for other opportunities would be wiser, given current conditions and the specific capabilities of available hunters. The decision comes to follow this herd for several days, watching and learning before making any attempt. And so the next morning, a group of 25 hunters sets out carrying weapons and minimal supplies, prepared to camp cold without fires that might alert the mammoths to human presence, willing to invest the time required to understand these specific animals and identify the moment when conditions align favorably for an actual hunting attempt. Following mammoth herds requires different skills than tracking individual animals like deer or horses that might be pursued directly and brought down within hours of first sighting, because mammoths move more slowly but cover greater distances through simple persistence, traveling 10 or 15 miles in a day without apparent effort. their long legs and tireless gait allowing them to cross landscapes that would exhaust human runners trying to maintain direct pursuit. Instead of following immediately behind where detection would be certain, the hunters position themselves parallel to the herd's direction of travel, moving through terrain that offers concealment while allowing periodic observation of the distant group, sometimes climbing to elevated positions where sight lines extend for miles to confirm the mammoth's location and direction, before descending again to continue parallel movement. Snow becomes valuable ally in this tracking because mammoth feet leave enormous clear prints pressed deep into surface, each track showing 5 distinct toes arranged in rough circle around the pad, prints so large that a human hand laid inside cannot span the full width, and these tracks remain visible for days unless new snow or wind erases them, creating a trail that hunters can follow even when the actual animals have moved beyond visual range. The tracking party reads these prints for information that goes far beyond simple direction of travel, with experienced trackers kneeling beside individual prints to examine depth and clarity, noting which prints press deeper, suggesting heavier animals or those carrying more weight on particular feet, observing the spacing between steps that indicates whether animals were walking slowly while feeding or moving with purpose toward water or migration routes, finding places where the herd stopped and grouped together, creating complex overlapping prints that show the social structure, with smaller juvenile prints clustered inside protective rings of larger female prints, while big bull prints appear at the edges or separate from the main concentration. They find places where mammoths scraped snow aside with tusks to reach buried vegetation, the disturbed snow showing how deeply they had to dig to find food, indicating how much snow has accumulated and how scarce surface feeding has become. Information that speaks to the animal's condition, because winter periods requiring extensive digging mean mammoths expend more energy for each mouthful of food, slowly depleting the fat reserves that will determine whether they survive until spring. Grasses emerge or weaken to points where hunting becomes possible. On the second day of following, the hunters observe the herd for extended period from concealed position on low ridge. Perhaps 300 paces distant, far enough that the mammoths show no signs of alarm, but close enough that details become visible through careful, patient watching. They note a juvenile mammoth, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, standing roughly 6 to 7 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing estimated 4,000 to 5,000 pounds. Not yet fully grown, but already larger than any individual hunter. And this young mammoth moves slightly separately from its mother, who appears focused on feeding, the juvenile wandering few steps away before returning, showing the independence that comes with age, but not yet having the wariness that full adults display constantly when predators or humans threaten. The hunters also observe an elderly female, her movements slower and stiffer than the others, her tusks worn down from decades of use, her ribs slightly more visible beneath hide and fur, suggesting diminished fat reserves that old age and possibly poor teeth make difficult to replenish. And several hunters discuss quietly whether this old female might represent the best target if opportunity develops, her age and condition making her more vulnerable, while her position within the herd's protective structure remains strong enough that separating her will require careful planning. Most importantly, the hunters note a young adult mammoth, perhaps 10 to 12 years old, standing 8 to 9 feet tall and weighing perhaps 7,000 to 8,000 pounds, positioned frequently at the edge of the herd with the restlessness that comes before full integration into stable social position. And this mammoth shows a slight limp in its left front leg, nothing dramatic but noticeable when watched carefully over time, a subtle favoring that might indicate old injury or developing joint problems that will worsen as the animal ages, but currently represents the kind of weakness that experienced hunters recognize as opportunity, because a mammoth that cannot run at full speed when threatened loses the primary defense that size and strength provide, making pursuit and repeated strikes possible where perfect health would allow easy escape. The decision forms gradually through the second day and confirms on the third. This limping young adult represents the best target in this herd, vulnerable enough to make hunting attempt reasonable but large enough to provide substantial food return, justifying the effort and risk, positioned frequently at herd edges where separation might be achieved through careful driving, young enough that tusks have not reached full size, meaning defensive capability remains significant but not maximum, and most critically, showing physical limitation that reduces the speed advantage that normally makes mammoth hunting impossibly dangerous when animals can simply run away from human hunters or charge faster than humans can retreat to safety. Knowledge of mammoth behavior accumulates across generations, transmitted from experienced hunters to younger members through detailed storytelling and direct observation in the field, creating collective understanding that no individual hunter could develop in single lifetime, but which becomes available to each new hunter through the cultural teaching that represents humanity's greatest advantage in this struggle between intelligence and size. The hunters watching this herd carry in their minds the accumulated observations of their fathers and grandfathers, and the hunters before them, stretching back through time, knowledge about how mammoths form social groups and maintain them across years, how they react to threats and defend against predators, what seasonal patterns govern their movements and feeding, where vulnerabilities exist in their otherwise nearly perfect defenses against hunters who lack the size or natural weapons to threaten them through direct confrontation. This knowledge transforms what might seem like random wandering animals into predictable beings whose behavior follows patterns that can be understood and anticipated and ultimately exploited by hunters patient enough to watch and clever enough to recognize the moments when mammoth behavior creates opportunity for human intelligence to overcome mammoth power. Mammoth herds structure themselves with remarkable consistency, with mature females forming the stable core of the group that remains together across years and seasons. These experienced matriarchs maintaining leadership through age and accumulated wisdom about landscape features, seasonal timing of migrations, locations of water sources, and best feeding areas, and appropriate responses to various threats from predators to environmental dangers like thin ice or unstable slopes that might kill or injure unwary animals. Young mammoths stay close to their mothers for the first several years of life, learning through observation and direct teaching the complex knowledge required to survive in landscapes where winter kills the unprepared and where resources shift seasonally, requiring movement to areas that current residents have never seen, but which elders remember from previous years. Female mammoths tend to remain with their natal groups throughout life, creating herds of related individuals who share genes and also share the cultural knowledge that females transmit to daughters and granddaughters, while young males gradually separate from these female-led groups as they mature, first spending more time at the periphery of herds they were born into, and eventually leaving entirely to lead more solitary lives or form temporary bachelor groups with other males. These bulls becoming the most difficult targets for hunters because their wariness and strength and aggressive responses to threats make approaching them more dangerous than potential food gain justifies. The defensive behavior that mammoth herds employ when threatened demonstrates the intelligence that makes these animals more than simple massive prey waiting to be killed by any group of hunters clever enough to throw spears, because mammoths recognize danger and respond with coordinated tactics that have evolved over millions of years of facing predators, including saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, dire wolves, and increasingly human hunters whose growing technological sophistication makes them the most dangerous predator mammoths face despite humans' pathetic physical weakness. When the herd detects threat, adults move to position themselves between danger and young animals, creating protective wall of massive bodies with tusks facing outward. Those curved ivory weapons capable of goring any predator that attempts to charge through this defensive formation, and the mammoths maintain this formation while slowly backing away from threat, or while standing their ground if retreat seems more dangerous than holding position, with coordination that requires communication through sounds below human hearing range, the deep rumbles that mammoths produce in their chests, carrying across miles to coordinate herd movement even when visual contact breaks. Large bulls react to threats with aggressive charges meant to drive predators away before they can position themselves advantageously. These charges reaching speeds approaching 20 miles per hour and covering distances that can close on human hunters before they can retreat to safety unless the hunters maintain awareness of the bull's position and intent. And the momentum behind 12,000 pounds moving at 20 miles per hour creates impact force sufficient to break bones and crush bodies and toss human hunters through the air like bundles of grass struck by wind, making any direct confrontation between human and charging mammoth result in certain human death and probable mammoth escape. Seasonal behavior patterns create vulnerabilities that hunters have learned to recognize and exploit, with late winter representing the time when mammoths reach their weakest condition after months of limited food and constant cold have depleted the fat reserves they built during summer feeding, making them slower and less able to maintain the vigilance that full health provides, slightly more desperate for food, creating willingness to feed in areas where terrain favors hunters, and marginally less capable of the explosive charges or sustained running that normally allows escape from human hunting pressure. The migration patterns that mammoths follow create additional moments of vulnerability when exhaustion from traveling hundreds of miles across difficult terrain leaves even healthy animals depleted and slower to react to threats, particularly during autumn migrations when herds move from summer feeding areas to winter ranges, following traditional routes that older females remember and teach to younger animals, or during spring migrations when winter weakness combines with the effort of traveling to create conditions where an animal already compromised by age or injury becomes truly vulnerable to sustained hunting pressure. The rut period that occurs during late summer creates distraction, particularly among bulls who focus on competing for mating opportunities and monitoring females for signs of receptivity rather than maintaining constant awareness of external threats. Though the increased aggression that bulls display during rut also makes hunting them more dangerous, meaning groups must balance the opportunity that distraction provides against the enhanced danger from males who will charge more readily and with less warning than they would during other seasons. Understanding these behavioral patterns allows hunters to predict how this specific herd will react when hunting attempt begins, knowing that initial strikes from multiple directions will create confusion and momentary disorganization of the defensive formation that mammoths instinctively form. Understanding that the limping young adult currently targeted will attempt to stay with the herd because isolation means death. And mammoths know this through instinct, refined across millennia of predator pressure, recognizing that if the targeted mammoth can be separated even briefly from the protective structure the herd provides, continued pressure can prevent it from rejoining before injuries accumulate to a point where it cannot maintain pace with the group, at which point the herd faces the biological calculation that all prey animals must make when threatened: sacrifice one weakened member to save the group, or risk the entire herd by slowing to accommodate the injured individual. And mammoth behavior in this situation follows predictable pattern where herds will attempt to protect injured members initially, but will eventually abandon them if the threat persists and the injured animal falls too far behind, creating the moment when human hunters can press the attack, knowing the herd will not turn back to defend. The weapons that the hunters carry transform impossible confrontation into manageable challenge, representing technological innovation that extends human capability far beyond what natural human anatomy provides, allowing humans to harm mammoths from distances that keep hunters safe from those devastating tusks and from charges that could close distance and kill hunters before they could retreat to safety. Each hunter carries a spear consisting of carefully crafted stone point measuring 4 to 6 inches in length. These points napped from fine-grained stone through patient work that chips away material to create sharp edges along both sides of the point and a lethal tip that tapers to edge thin enough to slice through hide when driven with sufficient force. The point secured to wooden shaft through binding method that embeds the stone into split shaft end and wraps it with sinew that shrinks as it dries, creating grip that holds the point firmly even under tremendous impact forces generated when spear strikes mammoth hide at high velocity. The wooden shaft extends 6 to 8 feet in length, cut from straight young trees or carefully straightened branches using fire and patient bending and scraping to create shaft that flies true without wobbling or veering. The wood selected for combination of weight and flexibility that allows the spear to absorb impact without breaking while remaining light enough that hunters can carry multiple spears on extended hunts without exhaustion, with total weight of the complete spear reaching perhaps 3 to 5 pounds, balanced to fly point first when thrown correctly. But the true technological innovation that makes mammoth hunting possible for humans whose physical throwing capability would otherwise be insufficient to harm animals with hide approaching 1 inch thick and massive muscle layers beneath, lies not in the spear itself, but in the throwing device that hunters have developed and refined across generations, a weapon that various groups call by different names, but which functions through the same basic principle, using mechanical advantage to extend the effective length of the human arm, multiplying the velocity that the arm alone could generate when throwing the spear by hand. The device consists of a shaft approximately 2 feet in length with a hook or cup at one end that engages the butt of the spear and a handle at the other end that the hunter grips. And when the hunter makes throwing motion, holding this device with the spear resting along its length, the extension adds roughly 2 feet to the effective length of the arm. And because velocity at the tip of a rotating object increases with distance from the rotation point, this additional length translates directly into increased velocity of the spear when it releases from the device, with the mechanical advantage roughly doubling or even tripling the velocity compared to hand-thrown spear, transforming a weapon that might achieve 30 to 50 feet of effective range and marginal penetration power when thrown by hand into a weapon that reaches effective ranges of 150 to 200 feet and strikes with force 2 to 3 times greater than hand throwing could produce. This increase in range fundamentally changes the dynamics of mammoth hunting, because hand-thrown spears effective only to 30 or 50 feet require hunters to approach within distances where mammoths can easily see, hear, and smell them, where a charging mammoth can cover the distance in seconds, leaving no time for retreat, where the mammoth's superior speed turns what should be a hunting attempt into a deadly confrontation, where human death becomes more likely than mammoth death. But the extended range that spear-throwing devices provide allows hunters to position themselves 150 or even 200 feet from the target mammoth, distances where the animal might not immediately identify the threat source or understand that danger approaches, where a charging mammoth must cover significantly more ground, giving hunters precious seconds to retreat behind terrain features or into positions where multiple hunters can deliver defensive strikes if the charge continues. And most critically, where multiple hunters can launch multiple spears at the target before the animal can react and close distance, allowing second and third and fourth strikes to hit the mammoth while it still attempts to understand where the threat originates and how to respond effectively. The increased striking force that higher velocity provides means that spears launched from these devices can penetrate the thick hide that covers most of the mammoth's body, driving the stone points deep enough to reach vital organs, or at minimum, to create wounds that bleed and weaken the animal over time, even if individual strikes don't immediately disable it. The effectiveness of these throwing devices requires practice that begins in childhood and continues throughout a hunter's life, developing the specific muscle memory and timing that creates smooth, coordinated motion where arm and device and spear move together as single, unified system. The throw, beginning with the spear resting along the device's length held behind the hunter's shoulder. The motion flowing forward with the device acting as extension of the arm, and the release occurring at precisely the right moment when velocity reaches maximum and the spear's alignment points directly toward target, the stone point flying forward while the device remains in the hunter's hand, ready to engage another spear for follow-up throw that might occur within seconds of the first. Hunters practice on stationary targets at various distances to develop accuracy that allows consistent strikes on areas the size of a basket at ranges exceeding 100 feet. And they practice on moving targets to develop the leading technique that accounts for target movement during the time between release and impact. And they practice rapid sequences where multiple spears are thrown in quick succession, because mammoth hunting requires not single perfect strike, but sustained pressure from multiple hunters delivering multiple wounds that accumulate until the massive animal's strength fails despite its enormous vitality and will to survive. The development of this technology represents generations of experimentation and refinement, with earlier hunters likely discovering that any extension of the arm increased throwing power and then gradually optimizing the device's length and balance and hook design through trial and error across countless hunts, teaching the improved designs to younger hunters who continued the refinement process, creating technological evolution where each generation inherited slightly better tools than the previous generation possessed, and in turn left slightly better tools to the next generation, with the accumulated improvements eventually producing weapons that transformed mammoth hunting from impossibility, requiring desperate luck, into achievable challenge, requiring careful planning and coordinated execution, but offering reasonable success rates that justify the effort and risk. Without these devices, humans could not hunt mammoths, except in rare circumstances where animals became trapped in bogs or injured in falls or weakened to point of near death from disease or age. But with these devices, humans gain the capability to kill healthy adult mammoths through sustained coordinated attack that exploits the range advantage to deliver multiple wounds while maintaining safety distance, turning the confrontation from impossible physical mismatch into contest between mammoth strength and endurance versus human intelligence and technological innovation. A contest that humans win often enough to make mammoth hunting a regular part of survival strategies in regions where these great animals still roam. The hunting party of 25 individuals represents not a collection of independent hunters, each pursuing their own goals, but rather a highly coordinated unit where every member understands their specific role and executes it in precise timing with the actions of others, creating the kind of seamless cooperation that makes success possible against prey animals whose size and power would overwhelm any smaller group or any group lacking the organization that transforms separate individuals into unified force. The coordination required for mammoth hunting exceeds anything needed for smaller prey like deer or rabbits that individual hunters or small groups can pursue and kill, because mammoth hunting demands simultaneous actions from multiple positions, requires maintaining awareness of what other hunters are doing even when they're not visible, depends on every hunter performing their assigned task at exactly the right moment, rather than improvising based on individual judgment, and punishes any breakdown in coordination with failure or death. As the mammoth exploits gaps in the human formation or targets isolated hunters who have moved out of position or failed to maintain communication with the group. The roles within the hunting party distribute according to experience and demonstrated capability, with the most experienced hunters serving as leaders who make critical decisions about when to begin the hunt, where to position hunters before engagement starts, how to respond when the mammoth behaves unexpectedly, and when to retreat if conditions become unfavorable or danger rises beyond acceptable levels. These lead hunters have participated in numerous mammoth hunts over years or decades, have seen what works and what fails, carry the hard-won knowledge that comes from watching hunts succeed and watching them end in disaster when coordination breaks down or when the mammoth proves stronger or faster or more clever than anticipated, and their judgment determines whether the group proceeds with the current plan or whether they abort the attempt and continue tracking to wait for better opportunity. 2 or 3 hunters serve as primary trackers who have spent the previous days observing this specific herd and who understand the targeted mammoth's behavior patterns and physical condition better than other hunters who joined the party more recently. These trackers positioning themselves where they can observe the mammoth's reactions during the hunt and call warnings if the animal behaves in ways that suggest greater strength or speed than expected, or if it moves toward terrain that would favor it over the hunters. 8 to 10 hunters serve as primary throwers who will deliver the initial strikes when engagement begins. These individuals positioned at locations surrounding the targeted mammoth so that strikes come from multiple directions, simultaneously creating confusion that prevents the animal from identifying single threat source and charging effectively. Each thrower carrying 4 to 6 spears, representing the full load that a hunter can manage during positioning phase while maintaining mobility and stealth, with the expectation that each thrower will launch at minimum 2 spears during the initial engagement phase, and possibly more during the sustained pressure phase that follows, if the mammoth attempts to flee rather than standing to fight or falling quickly from accumulated wounds. These throwers position themselves at distances ranging from 100 to 150 feet from the targeted mammoth, close enough that the spear-throwing devices deliver strikes with maximum force and accuracy, but far enough that the mammoth cannot close distance quickly if it identifies a specific thrower and decides to charge, with each thrower selecting position behind terrain feature like low ridge or large boulder or depression in ground that provides both concealment before the hunt begins and protection during the hunt. If the mammoth charges toward their position, requiring them to drop behind cover, while other hunters deliver strikes to turn the charge away. 4 to 6 hunters serve as drivers, whose role involves creating noise and movement that influences the mammoth's direction of movement when it attempts to flee from the initial strikes. These drivers positioning themselves on the side of the mammoth opposite from terrain, features that favor hunters such as bogs or steep slopes. And when engagement begins and the mammoth attempts to escape, The drivers reveal themselves shouting and waving hides or branches to create alarm that turns the fleeing animal away from clear terrain where its speed advantage would allow escape, and toward the difficult terrain where its massive weight becomes disadvantage while human agility remains effective. 2 to 3 hunters serve as safety monitors whose primary responsibility involves watching not the targeted mammoth, but the rest of the herd and the surrounding landscape for threats, including other mammoths who might charge to defend the targeted individual, predators like wolves or lions who might be drawn by the commotion and see opportunity to scavenge or even attack distracted humans, or changes in weather that might create danger if the hunt extends longer than anticipated and darkness or storm approaches, while hunters remain scattered across the landscape, focused on the mammoth rather than on their own safety. The coordination begins hours before any spear flies, with hunters gathering at dawn to review the plan one final time, each hunter confirming their understanding of their role and their position, discussing contingencies for various ways the mammoth might react, including charging toward throwers, requiring them to scatter and regroup, fleeing toward terrain that doesn't favor hunters, requiring quick decision about whether to continue pursuit or let this opportunity pass, or surprisingly falling quickly from lucky strikes to vital areas requiring rapid transition from hunting mode to butchering mode while remaining alert for predators attracted by fresh blood. The hunters move into positions using terrain and remaining darkness to conceal their movement, spreading across landscape in pattern that has been discussed and visualized. Each hunter moving independently to their assigned position, but maintaining awareness of where other hunters should be based on the plan, arriving at their positions and settling into stillness while the targeted mammoth continues its morning routine, unaware that danger has surrounded it during the dark hours before dawn. The wait lasts perhaps 2 to 3 hours while morning light strengthens and the mammoth moves gradually into the optimal position where its distance from the main herd has increased slightly, and where terrain features favor the hunter's plan, and where wind direction carries human scent away from the mammoth's position rather than toward it, alerting the animal to danger. The engagement begins not with single signal, but with the lead hunter's decision that conditions have aligned and the moment has arrived, and this hunter delivers the first strike that serves as signal to others. And within seconds, 8 spears fly from different positions converging on the mammoth that suddenly recognizes threat without understanding its source or extent. And the coordination continues through the chaos that follows as the massive animal reacts with speed that seems impossible for its bulk, attempting to locate the threat and respond with charge or flight, while human hunters maintain their positions and their roles, throwers launching additional spears as quickly as they can load and throw, drivers revealing themselves to influence direction. If the mammoth attempts flight, safety monitors scanning for additional threats, and lead hunters watching the mammoth's condition to determine whether continued pressure is working or whether the animal shows strength that suggests retreat would be wiser than pressing the attack. This coordinated effort, involving 25 individuals performing different tasks simultaneously while separated by distances that prevent verbal communication, and while facing animal whose power could kill any of them if coordination fails, represents achievement that demonstrates human capacity for cooperation and planning and role specialization, capabilities that existed long before agriculture or cities or written language, capabilities that allowed these hunters to overcome physical disadvantages that should have made mammoth hunting impossible for animals as weak and slow as humans, turning cooperation itself into a weapon more powerful than any tusk or fang that evolution ever produced. The landscape itself becomes part of the hunting strategy, with experienced hunters learning to read terrain features not simply as obstacles or paths, but as tactical advantages that can compensate for the massive physical disadvantages humans face when confronting animals 10 times their weight. Because while mammoths possess superior strength and speed and natural weapons across most terrain types, certain landscape features reverse these advantages or at minimum reduce them to levels where human agility and intelligence can compete effectively. The hunters tracking this particular herd have observed not only the mammoth's behavior and condition, but also the terrain through which the herd moves, identifying locations where bogs lie hidden beneath innocent-looking surfaces, where slopes steepen enough to slow massive animals while barely affecting lighter humans, where ravines cut across the landscape, creating barriers that channel movement into predictable paths, where water crossings force animals to slow and commit to routes they cannot easily abandon mid-crossing, and where cliff edges or steep drops create final boundaries beyond which even desperate fleeing animals will not go. This knowledge of landscape, accumulated through seasons of traveling the same regions and through cultural transmission from older hunters who learned from their elders, transforms terrain from neutral background into active element of hunting strategy that must be considered as carefully as weapon effectiveness or coordination timing. Bogs represent perhaps the most valuable terrain feature for mammoth hunting. These areas where water saturates soil beneath surface layers of vegetation and snow, creating ground that appears solid but cannot support weight of massive animals. And hunters learn to identify bog locations through subtle signs, including particular plant species that thrive in waterlogged conditions, slight depressions in otherwise flat terrain where water collects, changes in snow texture where underlying moisture affects how snow packs and settles, and in autumn before snow arrives, the bright green of bog vegetation contrasting with drier surrounding grasses. A mammoth weighing 12,000 pounds, standing on 4 feet each, covering perhaps 1 square foot of surface area, concentrates roughly 3,000 pounds per foot onto ground that must support this pressure. And when that foot presses onto bog surface, the pressure exceeds what the waterlogged soil can bear, causing the foot to sink through surface vegetation into the soft mud beneath. And once the mammoth attempts to pull the foot free for the next step, suction from the mud resists the lifting motion, requiring enormous effort to extract the foot. And if multiple feet sink simultaneously, the animal may become truly stuck, unable to generate leverage needed to pull itself free. Humans weighing 150 pounds distribute weight across 2 feet during running or 1 foot during walking, creating pressures of 75 to 150 pounds per square foot, roughly 1/20th the pressure that mammoth feet generate, meaning humans can cross bog surfaces that cannot support mammoths, running or walking across terrain where mammoths slow to labored struggling progress or become completely immobilized. The hunting party tracking this herd has identified a bog area roughly 1/4 mile from the herd's current position, the bog extending perhaps 200 paces in width and 300 paces in length, oriented such that the herd's natural movement pattern brings them near its edge during morning feeding. And the hunters have developed a plan that involves positioning throwers on the far side of the bog from the herd's approach, with drivers positioned to encourage the targeted mammoth to flee across the bog rather than away from it when initial strikes create alarm. If the plan succeeds and the mammoth enters the bog, its speed advantage disappears as feet sink and struggle to find purchase, while hunters can maintain positions at bog edges launching spears from stable ground, or can even follow onto the bog surface if necessary, using their lighter weight to cross terrain that traps the massive prey. Transforming what would be a chase, the mammoth would easily win into a prolonged engagement where the animal's strength drains fighting the terrain while human weapons continue striking from positions the mammoth cannot reach because mud and suction prevent the charges that would be its primary defense on solid ground. Archaeological evidence from mammoth kill sites shows that many successful hunts occurred at bog edges or in partially frozen lakes where terrain limited mammoth mobility, with some sites showing mammoth remains that include all bones in proper anatomical position, suggesting the animal died where it became stuck rather than being transported after death, confirming that humans deliberately exploited these terrain features as hunting tools. Steep slopes provide different advantages where the sheer weight that makes mammoths so formidable on level ground becomes liability on inclines, because climbing slopes requires lifting the entire body weight against gravity with each step, and an animal weighing 12,000 pounds must generate enough force to lift that mass vertically against gravitational pull while simultaneously maintaining forward momentum, creating energy demands that quickly exhaust even healthy animals, while humans weighing 150 pounds require only 1/80th the vertical lifting force per step, allowing hunters to maintain pace with fleeing mammoths on uphill terrain where the giant animals slow dramatically or even stop to rest, while humans continue climbing steadily. Downhill slopes present different challenges where mammoths' forward momentum combined with weight creates forces that stress leg joints and tendons beyond normal limits, with the animal forced to slow descent to avoid injury or loss of control, while lighter humans can descend more quickly with less risk, using agility to navigate around obstacles that mammoths must confront directly. The hunting party has noted several slopes in the region where terrain rises from flat plains to higher elevations through grades steep enough to slow mammoths substantially. And if the targeted mammoth can be driven toward these slopes, the terrain itself does work that would otherwise require additional human effort, tiring the animal through forced climbing or limiting its downhill escape speed to pace where human runners can maintain contact, allowing continued spear strikes throughout the pursuit. Ravines and gullies that cut across landscapes create natural barriers that channel animal movement into predictable paths, because mammoths avoid steep-sided ravines where descending means risking falls that could injure legs, or where the effort of climbing out the far side exceeds benefit of crossing. Instead, preferring to move parallel to ravines until they find crossing points where sides slope gently enough to permit safe passage. Hunters learn the locations of these crossing points through repeated observation of how animal herds move through the region, and when planning hunts, they position themselves to take advantage of this predictable channeling, placing throwers on both sides of ravines near crossing points so that fleeing mammoths must pass through zones where multiple hunters can strike, or positioning drivers to push animals toward ravines at locations where no good crossing exists, forcing the mammoth to choose between facing hunters or attempting dangerous descent into the ravine, with either choice favoring hunters over the animal that would prefer to flee across open terrain where speed provides advantage. Water crossings, including rivers and streams, force similar choices where mammoths must commit to crossing once they enter the water, the commitment eliminating the option to change direction mid-crossing because turning around in current requires more effort than continuing forward, and during crossing the animal's footing becomes uncertain on river bottoms, and its movement slows to careful stepping rather than rapid flight, creating moments of vulnerability where hunters positioned on the far bank can strike animals that cannot easily retreat or charge effectively. The most dramatic terrain feature that hunters exploit when opportunity permits is cliff edges or steep drops, where pursuing the mammoth to the edge creates possibility of the animal falling to its death or serious injury, eliminating the need for sustained spear strikes and allowing successful hunt through driving tactics rather than direct combat. The hunting party scouts terrain in advance, looking for locations where natural features create these opportunities, including bluffs overlooking rivers or valleys, edges of high plateaus, or steep-sided ravines where animals driven too close to the edge might lose footing and fall. And when conditions align properly with targeted mammoths positioned between hunters and cliff edges, the drivers can create panic that causes stampeding toward the edge, with the momentum and confusion preventing the animals from stopping before reaching the drop, resulting in falls that kill outright or injure severely enough that finishing the hunt requires minimal additional effort. Archaeological sites, including locations where multiple mammoth skeletons lie together at cliff bases, confirm that humans used this tactic successfully, with the positioning of remains and associated stone tools, indicating deliberate hunting rather than accidental falls that humans simply scavenged afterward. The use of terrain transforms mammoth hunting from impossible confrontation, where every physical advantage belongs to the prey, into strategic puzzle where hunters must consider not only their weapons and coordination, but also the three-dimensional landscape itself, learning to see features like bogs and slopes and ravines not as obstacles to movement but as tools to be exploited, understanding that successful hunts depend on positioning the mammoth in terrain that negates its natural advantages while amplifying human capabilities, requiring the patience to wait until the animal moves near favorable terrain rather than forcing engagement in locations where mammoth speed and power would make success unlikely. This sophisticated understanding of how terrain affects movement and capability demonstrates the cognitive sophistication that allowed humans to survive and thrive in landscapes filled with animals vastly more powerful than human bodies could ever match through muscle or tooth or claw, proving that intelligence applied systematically to environmental features creates advantages more reliable than physical strength could ever provide. The timing of mammoth hunts follows seasonal patterns that reflect hunters' understanding of how climate and resource availability affect animal condition. Because mammoths, like all large mammals, experience predictable cycles, where summer abundance builds fat reserves that carry them through winter scarcity, with late winter representing the point when months of limited food and constant cold stress have depleted those reserves to lowest levels, creating weakness that makes even powerful, healthy adults more vulnerable to hunting pressure than they would be during summer when condition peaks. Hunters learn these patterns through observation across years, noting that mammoths hunted in late winter yield less fat per animal, but also succumb more quickly to hunting pressure, while mammoths hunted in autumn yield maximum fat and resources, but possess peak strength and endurance, making hunts more dangerous and less likely to succeed. And this knowledge influences when groups invest effort in mammoth hunting versus focusing on smaller prey or stored foods or other survival activities that might offer better return on effort depending on season and current conditions. Late winter hunts, occurring during the months when snow remains deep and temperatures stay well below freezing, and when stored autumn foods in human camps begin running low, creating pressure to secure fresh meat, target mammoths that have spent 3 or 4 months enduring cold that forces their bodies to burn stored fat continuously to maintain body temperature, while available food has dwindled to scattered patches of dried grasses buried under snow that must be cleared away using tusks and trunks in exhausting work that often yields less energy than the effort required to access it. The fat layer beneath mammoth hide that might reach 6 inches thick during autumn has shrunk to perhaps 2 or 3 inches by late winter. And while this remains substantial by human standards, the depletion affects the animal's ability to sustain rapid movement or fight off injuries, making wounds that healthy autumn mammoths would survive through sheer vitality become more serious for winter-weakened animals whose bodies lack the energy reserves to support healing while also maintaining basic functions. Hunters can identify late winter weakness through visual observation when close enough, noting that ribs become slightly more visible through hide and fur, that movement seems marginally less fluid, that animals rest more frequently during travel. Subtle signs that experienced hunters learn to recognize as indicating reduced condition. Spring migrations create different vulnerabilities, where mammoths travel from winter ranges to summer feeding areas, following routes that might extend hundreds of miles across landscapes where terrain and weather create challenges even for healthy animals. And the cumulative effect of traveling this distance while already weakened from winter creates exhaustion that makes even successful arrivals in summer range leave animals depleted for a period of days or weeks, while they recover strength through feeding on new vegetation. Hunters who understand migration routes position themselves along these paths, waiting for herds to pass, targeting animals that show particular signs of exhaustion, including stragglers who fall behind the main herd, individuals who stumble frequently suggesting leg weakness, or animals that rest more frequently than others, indicating reduced endurance, and the timing of strikes during or immediately after difficult terrain crossings, like river fordings or mountain passes, takes advantage of momentary exhaustion when the mammoth has just completed exhausting effort and has not yet recovered strength, creating windows where vulnerability peaks for brief periods before normal resilience returns. Archaeological evidence of kill sites located along known migration routes, including mountain passes and river crossings, supports the interpretation that humans deliberately exploited migration exhaustion as hunting opportunity. Autumn rut periods, when male mammoths compete for mating opportunities, create different form of vulnerability, where distraction, rather than physical weakness, becomes the factor that hunters exploit, because bulls during rut focus enormous attention on locating receptive females, competing with rival males through displays and occasionally actual combat, monitoring the reproductive status of females in nearby herds, all of which diverts attention away from predator vigilance that normally keeps mammoths safe from hunting pressure. Bulls during rut also become more aggressive and less cautious, willing to approach areas they might normally avoid, responding to challenges with charges that might be tactically unwise, displaying behavior that, while dangerous, also creates predictability that hunters can exploit through tactics that provoke charges toward prepared positions or that take advantage of the bull's willingness to engage rather than flee. The increased aggression makes rut hunts more dangerous for hunters who might be charged with less provocation than would be typical outside breeding season. But this danger is partially offset by the distraction that makes initial positioning easier and that reduces the bull's likelihood of detecting hunting party before engagement begins. Early spring breakup periods, when ice begins melting on rivers and lakes, create environmental hazards that hunters can exploit as hunting opportunities. Because mammoths crossing frozen surfaces during winter develop routes across ice that seem safe based on previous successful crossings. But as temperatures warm, the ice weakens unpredictably, with strong, solid ice existing in some areas, while nearby sections have thinned to dangerous levels that cannot support mammoth weight but show no obvious visual differences from safe ice. Mammoths breaking through ice into cold water face immediate serious danger because the shock of immersion, the weight of waterlogged fur, and the difficulty of getting purchase on ice edges to pull themselves out can lead to drowning even for strong swimmers. And if the mammoth does escape the water, it faces hypothermia, as wet fur loses insulating properties and cold air draws heat from the body much faster than dry fur would permit. Hunters who observe mammoths near ice during breakup periods watch for opportunities where animals might be driven toward questionable ice, or where animals who have broken through and escaped are left weakened and hypothermic, vulnerable to hunting pressure that would be resisted easily under normal conditions, but which exhausted, cold-stressed animals cannot effectively counter. The seasonal timing strategy extends beyond simply choosing when to hunt individual animals to include multi-year patterns, where experienced hunters recall which years produced harsh winters that weakened herds substantially versus mild winters where herds remained strong, understanding that herds weakened 2 years previously might still show effects in current population structure, with fewer young animals surviving to current age, and with some adult animals never fully recovering condition lost during that harsh period. This long-term memory informs decisions about which herds to target and what success rates to expect, with hunters understanding that mammoth hunting is not equally viable every season, but rather depends on accumulated weather patterns and food availability that create variation in herd condition and vulnerability, making some winters highly favorable for mammoth hunting, while other winters make focus on smaller prey or stored foods. The wiser strategy and the judgment to recognize which conditions currently exist represents crucial knowledge that separates experienced hunters whose groups thrive from inexperienced hunters whose groups waste effort on hunts unlikely to succeed. The selection of which specific mammoth to target from among the many animals in a herd represents critical decision that substantially affects hunt success probability, because while all mammoths are large and dangerous and difficult to kill, significant variation exists between individuals in terms of size and strength and defensive capability and vulnerability to hunting pressure, with successful hunters learning to identify which animals present reasonable targets versus which animals should be avoided regardless of how favorable other conditions might appear. The hunters who have spent 3 days observing this particular herd have evaluated multiple individuals considering factors that would not be obvious to inexperienced observers, but which accumulated knowledge identifies as indicators of relative vulnerability or danger, and the decision to target the young adult mammoth showing slight limp rather than the elderly female or the juvenile or the apparently healthy adults represents conclusion based on complex assessment of multiple factors that must be balanced against each other. Juvenile mammoths representing animals between approximately 4 and 10 years old, standing between 5 and 8 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing between 3,000 and 7,000 pounds, depending on exact age and condition, offer advantages of reduced size, making them less dangerous than full adults if they do charge successfully, less capable of sustained flight, creating better chance of maintaining contact during pursuit, and still providing substantial food return, with even a 6-foot juvenile yielding perhaps 2,000 pounds of usable meat and significant hide and bone resources. However, juveniles also present disadvantages because their position within herd structure typically keeps them close to protective adults, particularly mothers who will defend offspring aggressively, and attempting to separate juvenile from this protection often triggers responses from multiple adults, making the hunt far more dangerous than targeting adults who might be abandoned by the herd when injured. And additionally, the cultural transmission of hunting knowledge includes strong preference against killing young animals when alternatives exist, because reducing future population diminishes long-term food security for human groups who depend on mammoth hunting across years and generations, creating conservation ethic based not on sentiment, but on practical understanding that preserving breeding populations ensures future hunting opportunities. Elderly mammoths showing visible signs of advanced age, including worn tusks ground down through decades of use. Stiffer movement, particularly visible when rising after resting or when navigating difficult terrain. Protruding ribs, indicating difficulty. Maintaining body condition, possibly due to worn teeth that reduce feeding efficiency, and sometimes visible injuries or deformities accumulated over long lives, represent potentially valuable targets because age-related weakness makes them more vulnerable to hunting pressure than prime adults in peak condition, and elderly animals that can no longer keep pace with herd movement during migrations or during flight from predators face natural death within relatively short time frames, meaning human hunting harvests resource that might otherwise be lost to scavengers or simple starvation. However, elderly mammoths retain formidable size and strength despite reduced capacity, can still kill hunters with lucky strikes from tusks or feet. And most critically, some elderly animals maintain positions of leadership within herds, particularly old females who serve as matriarchs, guiding group movement based on decades of accumulated knowledge, and targeting these individuals risks disrupting herd social structure in ways that might affect human hunting success in future years if the herd abandons traditional ranges or migration routes that hunters have learned to exploit. Prime adult mammoths in peak condition, representing animals between approximately 15 and 40 years old, standing 9 to 11 feet tall and weighing 10 to 13,000 pounds, with thick fat layers and powerful muscles and perfectly maintained defensive capabilities, offer maximum resource return if hunts succeed, providing perhaps 4,000 pounds of usable meat and enormous hides and massive bones. But these animals also present maximum danger and lowest success probability because their strength and speed and endurance allow them to flee effectively or fight successfully. Their position within herd social structure often keeps them surrounded by other adults, making separation difficult, and their experience with previous predator encounters makes them particularly alert to hunting pressure and quick to respond with coordinated defensive behaviors. Experienced hunters avoid targeting prime adults unless unusual circumstances create vulnerability, such as serious visible injury or illness, because the risk-to-reward calculation suggests that effort invested in hunting prime adults would more reliably yield success if instead directed toward more vulnerable individuals, even though those individuals provide smaller resource returns. The young adult mammoth currently targeted by this hunting party represents a carefully considered compromise between the various factors that determine hunt viability. Because this animal at approximately 10 to 12 years old and 8 to 9 feet tall and 7 to 8,000 pounds has passed beyond juvenile status, where herd protection would be most aggressive, but has not yet reached prime adult status, where strength and wariness would be maximum, providing substantial resource return approaching 3,000 pounds of meat while presenting reduced danger compared to larger adults. And most critically, the visible limp indicating possible leg injury creates specific vulnerability that experienced hunters recognize as significantly increasing success probability. The limp suggests that this mammoth cannot run at full speed, which for healthy mammoths approaches 20 miles per hour. And reduced running speed means the animal cannot easily escape sustained pursuit, or cannot charge effectively because charges require rapid acceleration to be effective at driving away threats, transforming an animal that would normally use speed as primary defense into an animal that must rely on endurance or fighting. Advantages that humans can counter through sustained coordinated pressure and distance weapons that allow striking without closing to fighting range. The positioning of this young adult at the edge of the herd structure rather than centered within protective formations indicates social status that, while not isolated or rejected, suggests this mammoth does not yet hold secure position within the group's social hierarchy, meaning other mammoths are less likely to risk themselves defending it if hunting pressure becomes severe, and the herd may abandon this individual if it falls behind during flight. Calculating that sacrificing one marginal member preserves the core group, including breeding females and their dependent young, whose survival matters more for herd continuity than the survival of a young adult male whose genes might or might not contribute to future generations. This cold biological calculation that mammoths make when threatened, abandoning injured members after initial defensive attempts fail, represents the moment that successful mammoth hunts depend upon, because humans cannot kill mammoths while the full herd defends them, but can kill isolated mammoths through sustained pressure that accumulates wounds until strength fails, and selecting targets that herds will likely abandon increases hunt success rates substantially compared to targeting animals like juveniles close to mothers or matriarch females that herds will defend persistently. The effectiveness of spear strikes depends not simply on hitting the mammoth, but on hitting specific areas where stone points can penetrate through hide and muscle to reach vital organs, whose damage creates wounds that weaken or kill, rather than merely annoying or enraging the animal without substantially affecting its capability to fight or flee. And hunters accumulate detailed knowledge of mammoth anatomy through generations of hunting experience and through careful observation during butchering of successful kills that reveals the internal structure and the relationships between external landmarks and internal organ positions. This anatomical knowledge, transmitted through patient teaching from experienced hunters to younger members, represents crucial component of hunting skill that cannot be gained through weapons practice or coordination drills alone, but requires understanding built through study of how mammoth bodies are constructed and where vulnerabilities exist in the otherwise remarkably well-protected structure that evolution has created to keep these giants alive, despite facing predators throughout their evolutionary history. The primary target area that experienced hunters teach first is the region immediately behind the shoulder blade, where the massive scapula that anchors front leg muscles creates a landmark visible even through thick fur, and where the ribs angling back from the spine create spacing that allows properly placed spear points to pass between the bones rather than striking them directly, and having penetration stopped by bone too strong for stone points to break through. A spear entering behind the shoulder blade at angle that follows the rib spacing toward the center of the body mass can penetrate 10 to 12 inches if thrown with sufficient force from spear thrower, and this penetration depth reaches the thoracic cavity where heart and lungs occupy space protected by ribs from direct frontal strikes, but accessible from this angled side approach, with damage to either organ creating wounds that are eventually fatal, even if not immediately disabling. The heart being struck causes massive blood loss into the chest cavity, leading to shock and death within minutes to hours, depending on exact nature of the wound, while lung strikes that puncture the tissue create breathing difficulty that reduces the animal's ability to sustain running or fighting, while also causing internal bleeding that weakens it progressively, and multiple lung strikes from coordinated group attack can cause rapid breathing failure that drops even enormous mammoths within relatively short time frames. The underbelly region, where hide thins relative to the massive thickness across shoulders and back, presents another target area that hunters exploit when positioning allows, particularly during later stages of hunts when the mammoth has weakened and slowed, allowing hunters to approach more closely than the 150-foot distances that characterize initial strikes, because the belly hide, while still substantial measures, perhaps half the thickness of back and shoulder hide, making penetration somewhat easier for given striking force, and spears entering the belly cavity can damage liver or stomach or intestines, creating wounds that, while not immediately fatal, cause internal bleeding and infection that weakens the animal over hours or days. However, belly strikes require closer approach, increasing danger from tusks and feet and from charges that can cover short distances before hunters can retreat to safety, meaning most hunting strategies emphasize the behind-shoulder strikes from safer distances during initial and middle phases of hunts, with belly strikes reserved for final phases when the mammoth has accumulated sufficient damage that its threat level has diminished to point where close approach becomes reasonable, calculated risk rather than near certain death sentence. The neck region, where it connects to shoulders, presents theoretically valuable target because major blood vessels, including carotid arteries, run through this area, carrying blood from heart to brain, and severing these vessels causes rapid unconsciousness and death within seconds as brain loses blood supply. But the practical difficulty of achieving strikes to this area makes it rarely viable target, because the mammoth's constant head movement makes precise strikes difficult. The thick hide and heavy muscles in this region resist penetration from all but perfect strikes, and the position requires hunters to strike from front or side angles where the mammoth can easily see them and respond with charges or defensive tusks used, creating danger that outweighs potential benefit, except in unusual circumstances where the mammoth has become immobilized or weakened to point where its defensive capabilities have largely failed. Hunters deliberately avoid strikes to certain body regions, where experience has demonstrated that even solid hits produce minimal effect on the mammoth's capability, with the massive shoulder and hindquarter muscles being primary examples, because these areas contain muscle layers so thick that even spears penetrating their full 10 to 12-inch length still fail to reach vital structures, instead lodging in muscle tissue that, while painful, does not substantially reduce the animal's ability to run or fight, essentially wasting a throw that could have been directed toward more productive target area. The head similarly represents poor target, despite being relatively easy to hit, because the skull bones are tremendously thick to protect the brain and to anchor the massive jaw muscles needed for grinding plant material and the trunk muscles that allow the versatile movements mammoths depend upon for feeding and sensing their environment, meaning spears striking the skull simply break or bounce off without creating any significant damage, while strikes to the trunk, while painful and possibly disabling to that particular organ, do not create wounds that threaten the animal's life or substantially reduce its ability to flee or defend itself beyond the temporary confusion and pain that any injury creates. The transmission of this anatomical knowledge occurs through multiple teaching methods, including verbal description, where experienced hunters explain the internal structure and the reasoning behind target selection, visual demonstration using drawings in snow or dirt that show mammoth outline and indicate the strike zones and the angles that allow penetration to vital areas, and most powerfully, through direct observation during butchering, when successful hunts create opportunities for younger hunters to see the actual internal anatomy and to observe how the spears that struck during the hunt penetrated or failed to penetrate, and what damage they created, with experienced hunters pointing out the heart and showing the scar where a spear grazed it but missed a fatal strike, or showing lung tissue punctured in multiple places by strikes that entered from proper angles, or showing ribs that deflected spears that hit at poor angles, demonstrating why precision in targeting matters more than simply hitting the large target that the mammoth's body presents. This teaching process extends across years as young hunters gradually build mental models of mammoth anatomy that allow them to visualize the internal structures when looking at living mammoths, and to judge angles and distances and timing to maximize the probability that their strikes will reach vital areas rather than lodging harmlessly in muscle or bouncing off bone, transforming raw throwing ability into effective hunting skill that converts throws into wounds that actually contribute to hunt success. Fire represents one of humanity's first controlled forces, and hunters have learned to employ it as hunting tool in ways that extend capability beyond what weapons alone could achieve. Because while spears and coordination and terrain advantages create opportunities to kill individual targeted animals, fire creates ability to influence the movement and behavior of entire herds across landscapes, driving them toward favorable terrain or away from escape routes, or into positions where hunting parties can engage them with maximum advantage. And this large-scale manipulation of animal behavior through environmental alteration demonstrates the sophisticated strategic thinking that characterizes human hunting at its most developed level. The use of fire as hunting tool requires understanding of how fire behaves in different vegetation types and weather conditions, how smoke moves with wind and affects animal behavior, how to start fires that will spread in desired directions while remaining controllable enough that they don't threaten the hunters themselves or destroy resources that groups depend upon, and how mammoths and other animals react to fire and smoke with behaviors that, while aimed at avoiding danger, can be predicted and exploited by hunters who understand these reaction patterns. Grassland fires set during dry conditions when wind blows steadily can spread across vast areas, creating walls of flame and dense smoke that mammoths instinctively flee from, moving away from the fire and smoke toward areas where air remains clear and ground unburned. And hunters who understand wind patterns and terrain can set fires upwind from areas where mammoth herds are located, timing the ignition so that fire spreads toward the herds during daylight hours, when visibility allows hunters to observe mammoth reactions and adjust their positions accordingly. The spreading fire creates predictable response where herds move away from advancing flames, generally traveling perpendicular to the wind direction that drives the fire, and hunters positioned ahead of this predictable movement path can prepare ambush positions in terrain that favors hunting, as discussed previously, including bog areas or steep slopes or ravine crossings, waiting for the fire-driven herds to arrive at these locations where the combination of fire pressure from behind and prepared hunters ahead creates situation where the mammoths must choose between facing flames or facing hunters, with neither option offering easy escape. The use of fire for hunting requires careful judgment about when conditions make this tactic viable versus when fire risks becoming uncontrollable, or when wind might shift directions endangering the hunters, or when the fire might destroy plant resources that groups depend upon for gathering, or might drive away other game animals, reducing overall food availability. And the decision to employ fire tactics represents major commitment, because once fires start, they cannot easily be stopped until they reach natural barriers like rivers or areas of sparse vegetation, or until weather changes extinguish them, meaning mistakes in fire setting can have consequences that persist long after the individual hunt ends. Archaeological evidence of systematic burning patterns in landscapes that mammoth herds inhabited during the Ice Age suggests that human groups did employ fire as landscape management tool affecting vegetation patterns and animal distributions, though the specific evidence of fire being used during individual hunts remains difficult to distinguish from evidence of fires set for other purposes like clearing ground for camping or promoting growth of preferred plant species that humans gathered for food or materials. Torches represent more controlled application of fire where individual hunters carry burning brands that can be waved to create visual barriers or movement that influences animal behavior without setting landscape fires that might spread beyond control. And coordinated groups of torch-bearing hunters can create lines of fire that channel animal movement by making certain directions appear blocked by flames while leaving other directions open, effectively herding animals toward desired positions through manipulation of perceived escape routes. The use of torches requires coordination where hunters position themselves in patterns that create effective barriers while leaving gaps through which animals will preferentially flee, with the gaps aligned with terrain features that favor subsequent hunting pressure. And the timing of torch reveals must be coordinated so that animals see the fire barriers after initial strikes have created alarm, but before they commit to flight directions that would take them toward unfavorable terrain from hunting perspective. Controlled burns conducted during seasons before hunting periods represents longer-term application of fire as hunting tool, where deliberately setting fires during late summer or autumn, when vegetation is dry, creates temporary clearings in areas where dense plant growth would otherwise provide cover, that allows animals to escape observation or that prevents hunters from moving freely during pursuits, and these cleared areas remain bare through the following months when new growth has not yet emerged, creating open ground where hunts can be conducted with better visibility and mobility than would be possible in unburned vegetation. Some researchers suggest that human groups during the Ice Age regularly burned sections of landscape in patterns that created mosaics of burned and unburned areas, with the burned areas attracting grazers who fed on the fresh growth that emerges after fires. Clear old vegetation, concentrating animals in predictable locations where hunters could find them reliably rather than having to search vast areas to locate dispersed herds. Though this interpretation remains debated among archaeologists who study Ice Age human behavior. The integration of fire tactics with other hunting strategies, including coordination and terrain exploitation and weapon technology, creates multi-layered approach where success depends on applying multiple advantages simultaneously rather than relying on any single factor, and the sophistication required to execute hunts that involve fire driving combined with prepared ambush positions and coordinated strikes from multiple hunters demonstrates cognitive and organizational capabilities that distinguish humans from all other predators who faced mammoths during the Ice Age. Because while wolves and lions possessed superior individual physical capabilities, including strength and speed and natural weapons, they lacked the capacity for the complex planning and the tool use and the delayed gratification and the group coordination across extended time frames that human mammoth hunting required, giving humans unique ability among Ice Age predators to successfully and regularly kill the largest land animals that walked the frozen landscapes. The investment of time that successful mammoth hunting requires separates this activity from nearly all other hunting that humans conduct, because while pursuing deer or rabbits or birds might involve hours of tracking and positioning before strikes occur, mammoth hunting demands days of patient observation and preparation before any hunting attempt begins, with the total time from first locating a herd to final butchering of a successful kill potentially extending across a week or more of sustained effort by the entire hunting party. and this willingness to invest such enormous time into single hunting attempts without any guarantee of success represents calculated decision based on understanding of the potential returns that justify the investment. The hunting party tracking this particular mammoth herd has already spent 3 full days observing and following before positioning themselves for the actual hunt attempt, and even now, as they wait in their assigned positions, they might wait additional hours or might ultimately decide that conditions do not favor attack and retreat to continue observing, adding yet another day to the investment before attempting again when circumstances align more favorably. The initial tracking phase, when scouts first locate herds and begin gathering information about their composition and movement patterns, typically requires 1 to 2 days of observation from varying distances and angles to build comprehensive understanding of how many animals the herd contains, what age and sex distribution exists within the group, whether any individuals show visible signs of vulnerability, including injuries or illness or age-related weakness, what routes the herd follows during daily feeding movements, where they water if water sources exist nearby, where they rest during midday or overnight hours, and how defensive formations organize when the herd perceives threats from predators or unusual disturbances in their environment. Scouts conducting this observation maintain distances of several hundred paces to avoid alerting the mammoths to human presence, using terrain features and vegetation to conceal themselves while they watch, remaining motionless for extended periods while the mammoths move through their normal routines and only moving to new observation positions when the herd's attention focuses elsewhere or when terrain blocks the mammoth's view, allowing scouts to relocate without being detected. The decision about whether to commit the full hunting party to pursuing this particular herd comes after scouts return with their reports and experienced hunters evaluate whether the information suggests reasonable probability of success, considering factors including whether vulnerable individuals have been identified whose condition or position make them viable targets, whether the terrain the herd currently occupies or seems likely to move toward includes features that favor hunters like bogs or slopes or ravines, whether the herd size and composition suggest that separating a targeted individual will be achievable, or whether the group cohesion appears too strong to overcome, whether weather patterns seem likely to remain favorable for the days required to complete a hunt, or whether approaching storms might force abandonment of the effort, and whether the hunting party's current size and experience level matches the challenge that this particular herd presents. If the evaluation concludes favorably, the full hunting party departs the main camp carrying weapons and minimal supplies, prepared to camp in the field for as many days as the hunt requires, accepting the discomfort of cold camps without fires and the uncertainty of whether days of effort will yield food or merely exhaustion. The positioning phase that follows the tracking phase requires additional 1 to 2 days as hunters move into locations that surround the targeted mammoth in patterns designed to deliver strikes from multiple directions simultaneously while maintaining safety distances and while ensuring that terrain features support the overall strategy. And this positioning must occur gradually, with hunters moving during hours when the herd's attention focuses elsewhere, freezing motionless when mammoths look toward their positions, using every terrain feature and vegetation patch to mask their approach, advancing perhaps only a few hundred paces per hour to avoid creating movement patterns that mammoth eyes might detect as threats. The patience required during this positioning phase tests hunters who must maintain focus and discipline across hours of slow, careful movement, followed by hours of motionless waiting in positions that might be uncomfortable and cold. Knowing that any premature movement or noise that alerts the mammoths will likely cause the herd to flee or shift to different areas, requiring abandonment of current positions and either attempting new positioning that might take another day, or abandoning this hunt entirely to search for different opportunities. The waiting phase that occurs once all hunters have reached their assigned positions represents perhaps the most psychologically challenging period, where every hunter remains concealed and ready, but cannot act until the lead hunter determines that the targeted mammoth has moved into optimal position relative to terrain features and wind direction and distance from the main herd, and this waiting might extend across 2 or 3 or even 4 hours, while the mammoth goes about its morning feeding routine, gradually moving closer to the ideal position, but not yet arriving there, with every hunter maintaining readiness, knowing that the signal to begin might come at any moment, but unable to predict exactly when, required to stay alert and prepared despite the numbing effect of cold and stillness and the tendency of minds to wander during extended periods without action. The discipline to maintain this waiting stance without moving or making noise or allowing attention to drift represents trained skill developed through years of hunting experience, with young hunters learning through participation in smaller hunts how to control their bodies and minds during these waiting periods, understanding that mammoth hunting demands mental endurance that equals or exceeds the physical endurance required for tracking and positioning. The willingness to abandon hunt attempts when conditions prove unfavorable represents a crucial component of successful hunting strategy that separates experienced hunters who achieve sustainable success rates from inexperienced hunters who force confrontations that result in failures or injuries or deaths because the investment of days into tracking and positioning creates psychological pressure to proceed with attack rather than accepting that the time was spent without achieving the desired outcome. But experienced hunters understand that attempting hunts under unfavorable conditions produces even worse outcomes where not only is time wasted, but hunters might be injured or killed, and the herd might be driven away from the region, reducing future hunting opportunities. The decision to retreat and continue observing comes when the targeted mammoth fails to separate adequately from herd protection, or when wind direction shifts, carrying human scent toward the mammoths, alerting them to danger, or when other mammoths position themselves in ways that would interfere with planned strike patterns, or when weather changes reducing visibility or creating conditions where tracking wounded animals would become difficult. And making this decision requires overriding the emotional desire to see return on invested effort in favor of rational assessment that conditions do not support reasonable success probability. The multi-day time frame that characterizes mammoth hunting creates logistical challenges for hunting parties who must maintain themselves in the field without the support infrastructure of main camps, carrying sufficient supplies to sustain energy during cold nights and days of exertion, but not so much weight that mobility suffers. Identifying safe camping locations that provide concealment from both the targeted mammoth herd and from other predators who might threaten sleeping humans, maintaining weapons in functional condition despite cold and moisture that can affect stone point hafting and wood flexibility, and managing group morale during days of discomfort and uncertainty when no guarantee exists, that effort will ultimately produce the food that would justify the hardship. The social bonds that develop among hunters during these extended field periods create cohesion that supports the coordination required during actual hunting engagements, with shared hardship building trust that each member will perform their assigned role when the critical moments arrive. And this trust cannot be created through brief training exercises, but requires the extended contact and mutual dependence that multi-day hunts provide. The moment arrives when the lead hunter determines that all factors have aligned as favorably as circumstances permit, with the targeted mammoth positioned approximately 150 feet from the nearest primary thrower and roughly 30 paces from the bog area that represents the key terrain feature in this hunt plan, separated from the main herd by perhaps 50 paces of clear ground, with wind direction carrying scent away from the mammoth's position, and with morning light providing clear visibility for accurate throws, while the mammoth feeds on vegetation with attention focused downward rather than scanning for threats. And the lead hunter makes the decision to proceed by delivering the first strike that will signal others to launch their spears in the coordinated opening that hours of planning has prepared. The spear flies from the throwing device with velocity that makes it nearly invisible during flight, crossing the 150-foot distance in perhaps 2 seconds and striking the mammoth in the target zone behind the left shoulder blade, penetrating through hide and muscle to reach the thoracic cavity where the stone point tears tissue and creates the first wound of what will be sustained engagement lasting potentially for hours before resolution. The mammoth's reaction is immediate, despite the wound not being instantly disabling, the animal lurching away from the impact and beginning to turn toward the direction from which the spear came, while simultaneously making deep rumbling vocalizations that alert other nearby mammoths to danger. But before this turn completes, 3 more spears arrive from different angles as the primary throwers execute their coordinated strikes according to plan, with one spear striking the mammoth's right side behind the shoulder, creating second thoracic wound, another striking the left hindquarter lodging in muscle without reaching vital organs, but creating pain and reduced mobility in that leg, and the third passing over the animal's back, missing entirely, as the mammoth's sudden movement causes the hunter's aim point to shift during the 2-second flight time. The mammoth now clearly understands that it is under attack, though it cannot identify how many threats exist or exactly where they are positioned, and its instinct drives it to flee toward the main herd where safety lies in numbers and in the defensive formation that mammoths instinctively create when threatened. But the drivers positioned between the mammoth and the herd reveal themselves shouting and waving hides, creating barrier of noise and movement that turns the fleeing animal away from its intended direction. The turned mammoth now runs toward the bog area exactly as the hunt plan anticipated, its injured left front leg creating visible limp that slows movement to perhaps 12 or 15 miles per hour, rather than the 20 miles per hour that healthy mammoths can achieve. And as it enters the bog, the surface that appeared solid reveals its true nature as the animal's left front foot breaks through vegetation into soft mud beneath. And when the mammoth attempts to pull the foot free for the next stride, the suction and the lack of solid footing prevent clean extraction, forcing the animal to struggle, while momentum carries it forward onto 3 legs, creating awkward stumbling motion that results in the right front foot also breaking through bog surface into mud. And now the mammoth finds itself with both front feet trapped in soft ground, while its rear legs on more solid surface behind cannot generate the forward push needed to pull the front feet free without solid footing for leverage. The primary throwers have used the time during the mammoth's flight to reload their throwing devices with fresh spears, and as the animal struggles in the bog, they advance to positions perhaps 100 feet from the trapped mammoth and deliver another coordinated series of strikes, with 5 spears flying nearly simultaneously, converging on the target, whose immobility makes aiming significantly easier than striking moving targets. And 4 of these 5 spears find their marks, with 3 striking behind the shoulders, adding thoracic wounds to those already bleeding, and 1 striking the neck region, creating wound that, while not severing major vessels, does damage blood-carrying vessels, causing additional bleeding that adds to the total blood loss. The mammoth continues struggling against the bog for perhaps 15 minutes, while hunters maintain positions around the edges, launching additional spears whenever throwing devices are reloaded, with some hunters moving to retrieve spears that missed or that struck but fell out when the mammoth's movements dislodged them. These fallen spears being valuable resources that cannot be wasted, and whose recovery allows sustained pressure without depleting the hunting party's spear supply, which, though substantial, is not unlimited. The accumulated wounds begin affecting the mammoth's strength, as blood loss reduces the oxygen-carrying capacity that muscles require for sustained exertion, and the struggling against bog suction that initially showed desperate power gradually weakens to less vigorous motions as fatigue and blood loss compound each other, and the mammoth's vocalizations that began as powerful trumpeting distress calls gradually diminish to quieter sounds that suggest weakening will and fading strength. The main herd that initially moved toward the trapped mammoth responding to distress calls has been turned away by drivers who created barriers of noise and fire from burning grass bundles they carried for this purpose, and the herd now moves away from the scene following instinct that places group survival above individual welfare, abandoning the trapped, weakening mammoth to its fate. After roughly 30 minutes of sustained struggle, the mammoth stops attempting to free itself from the bog and stands with front feet still trapped, but with struggling ceased, and its head lowers from the elevated alert position to hanging posture that experienced hunters recognize as indicating severe weakness approaching the point where death becomes inevitable even without additional strikes. And the breathing that should be regular and controlled shows labored quality with visible chest movements and sounds of air moving through damaged lungs where spear strikes have created holes that collapse the normal breathing mechanics. The lead hunter makes decision to approach more closely for finishing strikes rather than continuing to launch spears from distance, and several hunters advance to within 50 feet carrying spears for hand throwing rather than device throwing, because at this close range, hand throwing provides adequate force while allowing more careful aim at specific target points. And these finishing strikes target the heart and major vessels, with hunters aiming for behind shoulder locations where previous strikes have already created entry paths that make penetration to vital organs more certain, and 3 more spears enter the mammoth's chest cavity, creating wounds that finally damage the heart, directly causing massive bleeding into the chest that within minutes results in loss of blood pressure and shock, and finally death, as the great animal's legs fold and it settles into the bog mud that trapped it. The entire engagement from first strike to death has consumed approximately 45 minutes of sustained coordinated effort by 25 hunters, who between them launched perhaps 30 to 40 spears, of which perhaps 20 to 25 struck the target, creating wounds that contributed to the accumulating damage that finally exceeded the mammoth's tremendous vitality. And the hunters approached the fallen animal carefully, despite being confident of death, because experience teaches that wounded animals sometimes have reserves of strength that allow sudden, dangerous movements. And only after confirming through observations from multiple angles that no breathing occurs, and that no responses to sounds or movements near the body suggest remaining life, do the hunters begin the complex work of butchering that will occupy them for the next 2 to 3 days, while they transform this 8,000-pound animal into meat and hide and bone and sinew that will sustain their group through weeks of winter. The dead mammoth lying in the bog represents not the end of work, but rather the transition from hunting phase to processing phase that in many ways requires more sustained labor than the hunt itself demanded, because converting 8,000 pounds of mammoth into usable resources while preventing spoilage and while defending the kill from scavengers who will be attracted by the scent of blood requires coordinated effort by the entire hunting party, working continuously for days in conditions that remain cold and uncomfortable and potentially dangerous as wolves and other predators circle the kill site, hoping for opportunities to steal meat or to attack distracted humans. The processing begins even before full death confirmation, as hunters drain blood from major vessels to prevent it from pooling inside the body cavity, where it would complicate later meat extraction. And this blood itself represents valuable resource that can be collected in containers made from mammoth stomach or bladder and transported back to main camp, where it provides nutritional benefits and can be used in cooking or preserved through freezing, with approximately 20 to 30 gallons of blood being recoverable from a mammoth of this size. The initial butchering work involves opening the body cavity to access internal organs that must be removed quickly to prevent bacterial growth that would spoil meat from inside outward, and this opening requires cutting through hide approximately 1 inch thick, using stone tools that, while sharp, require repeated cutting motions and considerable pressure to penetrate the tough material, with hunters working in teams where some cut while others pull the hide away from the body, creating tension that makes cutting easier. And the opening cut runs from the throat region along the belly to the tail, creating access to the full length of the body cavity. The internal organs, including heart and lungs and liver and kidneys and stomach and intestines, are carefully removed with attention to avoiding rupturing the intestines, whose contents would contaminate meat with bacteria, making it unsafe to eat. And these organs themselves provide valuable food, with the liver being particularly prized for its dense nutrition, and the heart providing substantial meat, while intestines and stomach are cleaned and prepared for use as containers and storage vessels that will be needed for transporting fat and blood and other materials back to main camp. The hide removal represents major task that requires multiple hunters working together to carefully separate the skin from underlying meat and fat without damaging either material, using stone knives to cut connective tissue while pulling the hide away from the body with steady tension. And this work must proceed methodically around the entire animal, requiring that the body be rolled onto different sides to access all surfaces, with the bog location complicating this rolling because the ground provides poor footing and leverage, requiring hunters to use poles and ropes to shift the massive weight into positions where hide removal can continue. The complete hide from a mammoth of this size measures perhaps 12 to 15 feet in length and 8 to 10 feet in width when fully removed and spread flat, and weighs approximately 300 to 400 pounds when fresh, containing substantial moisture. And this enormous skin will provide covering for shelters, or can be cut into smaller pieces for clothing and containers and lashings, representing resource that will be used for months or years after this single hunt. The fat layer lying beneath the hide represents one of the most valuable products from mammoth hunting, because fat provides twice the calories per pound compared to lean meat, and stores well, and can be used both as food and as fuel for lamps, and as waterproofing material for clothing and shelters. And the fat layer on this late winter mammoth, while reduced from autumn levels, still measures perhaps 2 to 3 inches thick across much of the body, with thicker deposits around organs and along the back, yielding approximately 400 to 600 pounds of fat that must be carefully removed from the meat and stored in containers where it will solidify in the cold air, making transport easier. The meat itself represents the bulk of the usable resources, with approximately 2,000 to 2,500 pounds of muscle being accessible once bones and organs and hide and fat have been removed. And this meat must be cut into portions small enough that individuals can carry, while large enough that the number of pieces remains manageable, with hunters cutting along natural muscle divisions and removing meat from bones rather than attempting to transport entire bone-in sections that would be unnecessarily heavy. The bones, particularly the large leg bones and ribs and shoulder blades, provide resources including marrow that contains concentrated calories and that can be extracted by cracking bones open using stone tools and larger rocks, and the bones themselves serve as raw material for tools and weapons and structural elements for shelters, with some bones being carried back to camp immediately while others are marked with cuts or stacked in patterns that allow the hunters to return later to retrieve them after the initial loads of meat and hide and fat have been transported. The tusks, representing the most distinctive feature of mammoths, provide ivory that can be carved into tools or ornaments or weapons, though their great weight of perhaps 80 to 100 pounds each means they are typically retrieved during secondary trips to the kill site after lighter, more immediately necessary materials have been transported. The work of processing continues through daylight hours for the first day until darkness makes detailed cutting work dangerous, at which point hunters set up a cold camp near the kill site where they sleep in shifts, with some members always awake and alert for predators, attracted by the scent of blood and meat. And fires are finally permitted because the mammoth is dead and the smoke will not alert it to human presence. Though fires are kept small to conserve fuel and are positioned to create smoke that drives away wolves and other scavengers while providing minimal warmth for the working hunters. The second day sees continuation of meat removal and initial transport back to main camp by hunters carrying loads of perhaps 60 to 80 pounds of meat and fat, with each carrier making the journey back to camp that might be several miles distant, and then returning to the kill site to collect another load, and this transport work continues through the second and third days until all usable material has been moved to camp or to intermediate cache locations where it can be protected from scavengers until final transport to permanent storage occurs. The total caloric yield from this 8,000-pound mammoth, after accounting for bones and hide and waste material that cannot be eaten, provides approximately 3 to 4 million calories of food, primarily from meat and fat. And this quantity of calories can sustain a group of 40 people eating approximately 2,000 calories per person per day for approximately 60 to 80 days, meaning this single successful hunt provides nearly 3 months of food for a substantial group. And this return justifies the investment of 3 days of tracking plus 1 day of positioning and waiting, plus 45 minutes of active hunting, plus 3 days of processing, plus multiple days of transport, representing total effort of perhaps 200 person days of work for 40 people times 3 months of food equals 3,600 person days of nutrition, creating a ratio of roughly 18 to 1, where each day of work invested yields 18 days of food, making mammoth hunting one of the most efficient food acquisition strategies available to Ice Age humans when success rates remain reasonable, and when group size is sufficient to handle the logistics of processing and transport. The knowledge that makes successful mammoth hunting possible does not arise spontaneously in each generation, but rather accumulates across multiple generations through intentional teaching, where experienced hunters transmit what they have learned to younger members who will eventually carry this knowledge forward to the next generation, creating cultural continuity that allows human groups to maintain capabilities that no individual could develop through personal experience alone within a single lifetime. And this teaching process represents a crucial component of what makes humans successful as predators, despite lacking the physical capabilities that other large predators possess naturally through evolutionary adaptation. A young hunter beginning training at perhaps 10 to 12 years old will spend the next 10 to 15 years gradually developing the skills and knowledge required to function as fully capable mammoth hunter, with this extended learning period reflecting the complexity of what must be mastered, including weapon construction and throwing technique and animal behavior, understanding and terrain reading and coordination capability and anatomical knowledge and decision-making judgment that separates successful hunts from failures. The initial teaching focuses on weapon skills, starting with basic spear throwing without the throwing device to develop fundamental technique for smooth motion and accurate release and target tracking, and young hunters practice on stationary targets at varying distances, learning to adjust aim for different ranges and to compensate for wind that deflects light spears during flight. And this practice occurs over months and years with thousands of throws required before accuracy becomes consistent enough that the young hunter can reliably hit targets the size of a basket at distances of 30 to 50 feet. The introduction of the spear throwing device represents next stage of training where the extension changes the mechanics of throwing in ways that require relearning the motion pattern, with young hunters initially struggling to coordinate the device with their throwing motion, often releasing too early or too late, causing spears to fly wild or to lose velocity. And experienced hunters demonstrate proper technique repeatedly while correcting errors that young hunters make until the new motion pattern becomes automatic through muscle memory built from additional thousands of practice throws. The teaching of animal behavior knowledge occurs through multiple methods, including direct observation, where young hunters accompany experienced scouts during tracking phases of hunts, watching how the older hunters read tracks and interpret signs and predict where herds will move based on terrain and season and weather, and through storytelling, where experienced hunters recount past hunts in detailed narratives that describe not only what happened, but why certain decisions were made and what indicators suggested that particular approaches would succeed or fail, and through questioning, where young hunters ask about aspects of mammoth behavior they have observed and experienced. Hunters explain the underlying patterns based on accumulated knowledge from many years of observation. The young hunters learn that female mammoths with young stay in protective groups and defend aggressively, that old bulls become more solitary and wary, that injured animals show subtle signs in their movement patterns, that herds follow traditional migration routes that can be learned and anticipated, that mammoths react to threats by forming defensive circles with young and weak members inside, and hundreds of other behavioral details that inform hunting strategy decisions. The terrain reading skills develop through experience in landscapes where young hunters learn to recognize bog indicators, to judge slope steepness and how it affects different-sized animals differently, to identify ravine crossing points that animals will use predictably, to assess how wind patterns in specific locations create favorable or unfavorable conditions for approaching animals without being detected, and to remember landscape features across seasons and years, so that when herds appear in particular regions, the hunters already know where terrain advantages exist that can be exploited during hunts. This knowledge builds gradually as young hunters travel across territories during various activities, including hunting and gathering and moving between camps, with experienced members pointing out significant features and explaining their relevance to hunting strategy, and through participating in multiple hunts, where young hunters observe how terrain influences hunt success or failure, creating concrete examples that reinforce abstract teaching. The coordination capabilities develop through participation in hunts for smaller prey, where young hunters first learn basic concepts of maintaining positions and watching for signals and executing assigned roles in simpler contexts before graduating to mammoth hunts, where coordination demands reach maximum complexity, and through practice exercises where groups rehearse specific scenarios like coordinated strikes from multiple positions or driving animals toward terrain features, and through debriefing after hunts where the group discusses what worked and what could be improved, allowing young hunters to develop mental models of how coordination functions and why specific patterns produce better results than alternatives. The experienced hunters deliberately include young members in planning discussions before hunts, so they hear the reasoning behind decisions about positioning and timing and target selection, creating understanding of strategic thinking rather than just tactical execution. The anatomical knowledge transmission occurs through observation during butchering, as discussed previously, with experienced hunters specifically teaching young members by pointing out internal structures and explaining relationships between external landmarks and internal organ positions, and demonstrating proper angles for spear strikes to reach vital areas, and through the use of bones and hides from previous kills to create teaching materials where hunters can demonstrate strike angles on actual mammoth bones, showing how spears must pass between ribs rather than striking them directly. This teaching often includes discussion of unsuccessful strikes from past hunts, where experienced hunters describe how certain throws failed to penetrate or missed vital areas despite appearing to hit appropriate target zones, helping young hunters understand that even experienced hunters make errors and that learning continues throughout careers rather than reaching perfection at some point. The most important knowledge that experienced hunters transmit to younger members is judgment about when to hunt versus when to retreat, when to continue pressing an attack versus when to abandon the attempt, when to take calculated risks versus when to prioritize safety. And this judgment cannot be taught through simple rules, but requires young hunters to observe decision-making across many situations, building understanding of the complex factors that inform these choices, and this learning occurs primarily through participation in actual hunts, where young hunters see experienced leaders make these judgment calls and can later discuss why particular decisions were made, gradually developing their own capacity for nuanced risk assessment that considers not only immediate tactical situation, but also broader context, including group food needs and current danger levels and alternative hunting opportunities that might be available. The transmission of this accumulated knowledge across generations allows human groups to maintain mammoth hunting capability despite the enormous challenges that this hunting presents, creating cultural evolution where each generation refines techniques slightly and passes improvements forward, building over time the sophisticated hunting strategies that allow success rates sufficient to make mammoth hunting viable component of survival strategies in Ice Age landscapes. The successful hunting of mammoths by humans weighing 150 pounds, killing animals weighing 12,000 pounds, represents achievement that seems impossible when considering only the physical capabilities of the species involved, because by every measure of strength and speed and natural weaponry and defensive capability, the mammoth possesses overwhelming advantages that should make humans ineffective as threats to healthy adult animals. Yet the archaeological record clearly documents that humans regularly killed mammoths throughout the Ice Age period across vast geographic ranges, including Europe and Asia and North America, wherever these great animals and human groups coexisted, with kill sites showing patterns of repeated successful hunts rather than rare lucky circumstances, indicating that something about human capability allowed systematic overcoming of massive physical disadvantages through means that other predators facing mammoths could not replicate despite possessing their own formidable natural weapons and hunting skills. The explanation for this improbable success lies not in any single human capability, but in the combination of multiple specifically human traits working together to create integrated hunting system where each component amplifies the others, producing total capability far exceeding what any single element could achieve independently, beginning with cognitive ability to observe animal behavior across extended time periods and to extract patterns from these observations that allow prediction of future behavior and identification of vulnerabilities, continuing through capacity for patient multi-day planning that delays immediate action in favor of positioning and preparation that increases eventual success probability, expressed through cooperative coordination requiring 25 or more individuals to maintain specialized roles across hours of positioning and waiting and sustained engagement, implemented through technological innovation that extends natural human throwing capability threefold, creating weapons effective at ranges far beyond what unaided human arms could achieve, enhanced through sophisticated understanding of how terrain features affect movement and capability differently for heavy versus light animals, timed through seasonal and behavioral knowledge indicating when targets are most vulnerable, focused through anatomical understanding that directs strikes to specific body regions where stone points can reach vital organs, maintained through cultural transmission that allows each generation to build upon knowledge accumulated by ancestors rather than starting from zero. The tracking capability that allows humans to follow mammoth herds for days while remaining undetected and while gathering detailed information about individual animals within herds represents cognitive skill requiring memory for landmarks and routes, pattern recognition for interpreting tracks and signs, understanding of animal behavior to predict movement, and patience to invest days in observation before attempting any action, with this combination creating ability to select specific vulnerable individuals from herds rather than encountering mammoths randomly and attempting to hunt whatever animals happen to be available, regardless of whether they represent viable targets. The investment of 3 to 5 days in tracking before hunting attempts begin transforms mammal hunting from desperate gamble into calculated strategy, where success probability increases substantially because effort focuses on animals whose age or injury or position within herd structure makes them realistically killable, rather than wasting effort on prime adults who would likely survive hunting pressure or escape entirely. The coordination capability allowing 25 individuals to function as integrated unit, where each member performs specialized role in precise timing with others, despite being separated by distances preventing verbal communication, represents organizational sophistication requiring pre-hunt planning to assign roles and establish action sequences, shared mental models allowing each hunter to predict what others will do based on current situation, discipline to maintain positions and await signals rather than acting independently, and trust that each member will execute their assignment competently, creating interdependence where any failure affects overall group success. This coordination transforms collection of individuals, each capable of throwing spears moderately well, into a hunting machine that delivers simultaneous strikes from multiple angles, creating effects that no sequence of individual hunters could achieve, because the mammoth would respond to each strike and adjust its defensive posture, while simultaneous strikes from multiple positions create confusion, preventing effective defensive response. The spear thrower technology represents innovation requiring experimentation across generations to optimize device length and balance and hook design, producing tool that multiplies human throwing velocity by a factor of 2 to 3 and extends effective range from 30-50 feet to 150-200 feet, fundamentally changing the tactical equation from requiring dangerous close approach where mammoth can charge and kill hunters to allowing strikes from positions where hunters maintain safety margins of several seconds before the animal can close distance. This technological advantage, created through intelligent tool design rather than through biological evolution, demonstrates how humans overcome physical limitations through innovations that effectively give them capabilities they do not naturally possess. With the spear thrower functioning as artificial extension of the arm that achieves through mechanical advantage what natural selection did not provide through genetic changes. The terrain exploitation strategy demonstrates cognitive mapping capability, where hunters build mental models of how different landscape features, including bogs and slopes and ravines, affect mammoth mobility and human mobility differently, and how these differential effects can be deliberately utilized by driving animals toward terrain where their size becomes disadvantage, while human lighter weight maintains or even enhances capability, creating situations where the usual mammoth advantages of superior speed and strength become irrelevant or even counterproductive when feet sink into bogs or when massive weight must be lifted uphill against gravity. The identification and strategic use of terrain represents sophisticated environmental understanding that goes beyond simple recognition of obstacles to active manipulation of the three-dimensional landscape as tactical tool. The seasonal timing strategy reflects understanding of how climate and food availability affect animal condition across annual cycles, with late winter representing period when months of cold and limited food have depleted fat reserves, creating weakness that makes even formidable adults more vulnerable than they would be during summer when condition peaks, and how migration patterns create exhaustion during and after long-distance travel, and how behavioral changes during rut periods create distraction in males that reduces vigilance. With this knowledge allowing humans to time hunting attempts to align with periods when success probability increases, rather than attempting hunts randomly throughout the year regardless of animal condition. The patience to wait for optimal seasonal timing rather than hunting whenever hunger demands demonstrates delayed gratification capability and planning horizon extending across months or years that distinguishes human cognition from that of other predators who respond primarily to immediate circumstances. The selective targeting of vulnerable individuals, including injured animals and elderly mammoths and young adults, not yet fully integrated into protective herd structures, demonstrates assessment capability, requiring observation of subtle movement patterns and behavioral indicators that reveal which specific animals within herds present realistic opportunities versus which animals should be avoided due to strength or position or defensive capability. With this discrimination allowing focus of effort on targets where success probability justifies the multi-day investment required for mammoth hunting, while avoiding targets where even perfect execution would likely fail due to the animal's inherent capabilities or herd protection. The conservation ethic implicit in generally avoiding juveniles close to mothers reflects understanding that preserving breeding populations ensures future hunting opportunities, creating sustainable long-term strategy, rather than maximizing short-term returns. The anatomical knowledge directing strikes to regions behind shoulders, where spears can penetrate between ribs to reach heart and lungs, rather than striking massive muscle groups where penetration depth proves insufficient to harm vital organs, demonstrates understanding of internal body structure that humans gain through observation during butchering of previous kills and through cultural teaching across generations, with this knowledge transforming random strikes that might hit anywhere on large target presented by mammoth body into precisely aimed strikes that concentrate damage in regions where it will be most effective, substantially increasing the damage that each thrown spear creates and reducing the total number of strikes required to weaken the animal to point where death becomes inevitable. The processing capability that allows 25 humans to transform 8,000-pound animal into usable resources within 3 days through coordinated butchering and transport demonstrates organizational skill and knowledge of preservation techniques and ability to defend kill site from scavengers, with the efficiency of processing directly affecting the return on hunting investment because unsuccessful processing would waste much of the resource gain, making the multi-day hunt effort unjustifiable, while efficient processing that recovers 3 to 4 million calories of usable food provides 60 to 80 days of sustenance for 40 people, creating return ratio of 18 to 1, where each day invested yields 18 days of food. The cultural transmission that allows each generation to inherit accumulated knowledge from ancestors and to build upon it, rather than discovering everything anew, represents capacity for teaching and learning and language that creates cumulative cultural evolution, where human capabilities increase over generations even without genetic changes, allowing groups to maintain complex skills like mammoth hunting that require more knowledge than any individual could develop through personal experience alone in single lifetime, with this transmission occurring through multiple teaching methods, including demonstration and storytelling and supervised practice and correction of errors over years-long learning periods that gradually develop competent hunters from young children who begin training around age 10. When all these capabilities combine in coordinated application during mammoth hunts, the result demonstrates that intelligence expressed through planning and cooperation and technology and accumulated knowledge and strategic thinking can overcome massive physical disadvantages that appear insurmountable when considering only immediate physical confrontation between individual human and individual mammoth, proving that human cognitive and social capabilities represent survival advantages equal to or exceeding the claws and fangs and strength that other predators possess, and explaining how relatively weak, slow, small humans became the most successful large game hunters in Ice Age landscapes, despite competing with lions and wolves and other formidable predators who possessed natural weapons that humans utterly lacked, because while those predators relied primarily on physical capabilities that remained relatively static across their lifespans, humans relied on accumulated cultural knowledge and technological innovation that compounded across generations, creating advantages that no amount of muscle or tooth could match, making intelligence and cooperation and planning and tool use and cultural learning the ultimate predator adaptations that allowed Ice Age humans not merely to survive, but to thrive in landscapes where the largest and most dangerous animals walked.